This has been over the last several years, us stepping into the Second Amendment space to say, how do we as conservatives understand the very real problems of gun violence, and how do we approach that with a respect for the Second Amendment rights of peaceable citizens?
You're listening to Talking About Guns, or TAG as we like to call it. My name is Matt Littman. I'm Executive Director of 97%. We're a new bipartisan organization working to reduce gun deaths in America. As part of our mission to change the conversation around gun safety, TAG normalizes dialogue about guns. We invite guests from all sides of the gun debate and talk about the hot button issues, but without the screaming. Later in this episode, Dr. Michael Siegel, a renowned researcher and professor at Tufts University, joins us for another edition of Siegel's Scope, where he dives into the just-released research 97% and Dr. Michael Siegel have been collaborating on for much of the past year. But first, my guest today is a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation who specializes in the Second Amendment at the conservative think tank. Following Uvalde and Buffalo, she recently testified before the House Oversight and Senate Judiciary Committees about solutions to gun violence that do not infringe on the rights of law-abiding gun owners. Amy Swearer from the Heritage Foundation, welcome to TAG.
Thank you so much for having me.
Amy, you are one of the leading experts on the Second Amendment in the country. It's not an easy field. How did you get into this? How did you choose for this to be your area of expertise?
I always love that question because I don't have some great, well thought out, like here was my 10-step plan of getting into the Second Amendment space. And actually, I feel like that's a lot of people I know in this field. It was actually by accident. So I went to law school. I wanted to do criminal law, was clerking at a public defender's office, our 3L year, basically running the mental health docket. And I ended up getting into the Heritage Foundation as a visiting legal fellow focusing on overcriminalization. Based on my background with defense and mental health policy, essentially this idea of we have too many laws, no one knows what they are, we're putting people in prison for things that they had no reason to suspect were criminal and that are not like inherently morally wrong. And it sort of evolved into looking at the Second Amendment rights from an overcrim perspective. In particular, this idea of nonviolent felons and having their Second Amendment rights restored. Like, why can't Martha Stewart have a gun, sort of thing. And it just happened to coincide with, at the time, this was like 2017, and if you recall, there were a number of very high-profile mass public shootings. And I started writing on those and the responses to those, again, entirely from an overcriminalization standpoint. And it turns out that there just happened to be an opportunity. I think Heritage at the time saw what was happening and said, look, we can't stay quiet on the gun violence issue anymore. We need to step into this conversation to add a conservative voice to this. And I just happened to be at the right place at the right time when we started up what we then termed our school safety initiative. And over the years, there's not a lack of work and things to talk about in the Second Amendment space. And so it kind of became, in many respects, a full-time job doing Second Amendment work and as part of what I do in public policy. So it evolved. It was not something that I set out to do.
Yeah.
But I'm very grateful for how that evolved because I love what I do. I love the opportunity to work in a space that, yes, touches on Second Amendment rights, but also touches very meaningfully on the question of how do we save lives? How do we make a direct impact and difference in the lives of Americans? And so it's very important.
So you already, even that answer brings a bunch of questions, right? So first of all, just so folks know, the Heritage Foundation is one of the leading think tanks in the country, works on a bunch of issues, right? And more
Correct.
so in the Republican conservative space, has a lot of influence and has, since I can recall, basically for many, many years. And then you're saying that there's basically a vacuum for Second Amendment rights advocates who have your education level, let's say, and you were able to fill that vacuum, that void, is that right?
Sure, yeah. So I when you look at the Second Amendment space, a lot of the voices tend to come from the left, and so you sort of had this vacuum of, at least from a conservative standpoint, of what does conservative policy look like? How do we as conservatives step in and have that conversation? Because I feel like a lot of times what happens is conservatives want to remove themselves from that conversation. They say, no, like we're not talking about gun control. Like we're just anti-gun control and we're not really going to get into it. And so this has become, I think, increasingly important. You're starting to see more of this. But to have conservatives lend their voice to that, because you're correct. I mean, heritage focuses on a lot of things. It is generally about public policy from a conservative perspective, about a prosperous, free America where civil society flourishes, whether that's education, foreign policy, economics. But this has been, over the last several years, us stepping into the Second Amendment space to say, how do we as conservatives understand the very real problems of gun violence, and how do we approach that with a respect for the Second Amendment rights of peaceable citizens? And so it's been, it's been a process of figuring out how we as conservatives talk about that. But I think it's been good. It's been healthy for the national conversation, and I think it's healthy for conservatives
Right.
to step in and say, no, we have a voice.
Absolutely.
We have a voice. We have a perspective on this.
So let's get to that in a second, because there's a lot to talk about in that. But you also mentioned a school safety program. Mm-hmm. So you're not just talking about the Second Amendment, you're advocating for ideas you think that can make the country safer. And that school safety initiative is one of them. What is that exactly?
So our school safety initiative was started up after the tragic 2018 shootings in Parkland, Florida, at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. Our former president of Heritage at the time, I think, very on the ball with this, recognized that was a moment of, one, great tragedy, but also national importance, that this conversation was not going away. And that we needed to step into that space specifically with what school safety looks like. And so we decided to take a comprehensive approach to it. So to start with, one, what is the reality of how safe or unsafe are our kids at school? It turns out, despite very high-profile tragedies, they are actually generally pretty safe at school. We want them to be safer. We want to make sure this doesn't happen. And so looking at ideas of how do we foster school security, for example, without over criminalizing schools, right, and turning them into prisons, and how do we sort of leave it at a state and local level, and how do we do crisis intervention? Essentially, how do we ensure that Parkland doesn't happen again? And so we do have that school safety initiative is still up on our website.
Didn't you mention in one of the times you testified in Congress, $100 million that was available for funding for school safety? I thought I heard you say that.
Right. So that comes from one. So there have been some school safety funding programs that have come out directly for school safety, including most recently, I think there was school safety funding specifically in one of the bills that was passed earlier in the last Congress. But also the idea of shifting COVID funds. So schools right now are still awash with unused COVID funds. And the idea of allowing them to take a lot of that unused money and turn that into school safety, since they're awash. And I mean, there's just so much they don't know what to do with it, and allowing that to be opened up for other uses as well.
And then I think, one, as we talk about the things that you work on in your area of expertise, it seems to me that you're the go-to person on Capitol Hill to give congressional testimony on the Second Amendment. I think I've seen you a bunch of times, even at a budget committee, I think, hearing you testified as well.
So it's the Joint Economic Committee.
Right. Is the first time you do that, aren't you nervous going up there, or are you not nervous talking to a bunch of members of Congress on a panel?
Yeah, so I mean, my first time testifying was 2019 in front of the House, and it's been several more times.
This was after the Florida school shooting.
Correct.
Right.
Correct. Like the first time you testify in front of Congress, on the one hand, it's a great honor, especially as a policy person. This is sort of the pinnacle of what you do. This is what you hope for, to get in front of policymakers and to be able to talk with them, and to have that conversation. That's the whole point. That's what that's literally what our job is supposed to be. But on the other hand, nothing really prepares you for the reality that sometimes these hearings they're not always structured in a way to be conducive to that. And that it ends up being a lot more confrontational, and a lot less conversational. And I think that there's a disappointment in that.
You did say it was the world's greatest deliberative body one time you were there, and I was almost. Some people might disagree at this point.
It's supposed to be.
Right.
It's supposed to be. So yeah, you go through it. You learn. Nothing really prepares you for that first time, except the experience that you get that comes with it. Being able to figure out how better to convey your ideas, to open yourself up to helpful questions, to get that conversation going. But at the end of the day, you are there at the bequest of Congress. You only get to speak so much as you are asked questions.
Right. They could take the whole time and not ask you any questions.
Right. And honestly, I think sometimes that is the most frustrating.
Right.
The most frustrating part is, you get called and you listen to pontification.
That's right.
Instead of being asked questions that could foster, an understanding of what good policy looks like. So you're right. That is sometimes the most disappointing.
Well, there was a time I was watching you, Amy, and it was very interesting because I'm going to give a specific example. Senator Durbin from Illinois was speaking, and he asked you not to speak about something specifically because the other person wasn't there, right? But what I was amazed by watching you, Amy, was that you did it. He said basically, let's stop here, and you still got in your statement. And I just have to say, it takes a lot of self-confidence to be able to do that when somebody's telling you, maybe don't.
Yeah, that was certainly unexpected. In fact, I've had several people now tell me they've never seen that happen before, to have a witness's opening statement interrupted like that. From a sort of cynical political aspect, I understand why that happened. Certainly didn't anticipate it. But at the end of the day, when you go into testifying before Congress, you're supposed to go in prepared. To have a point that you want to make, and to meet that point. The reason we had been called to Chicago to that field hearing was to talk about the very sorts of things that the chairman at that point asked me not to bring up. And it was just too important. It was too important of a point to let that go. That's why I was there. And so I appreciate your kind words. That was, again, one of those things you can't anticipate that. You just have to sort of roll with the punches as it happens. But that's not unique to me. I think that's just sort of part of the. I hesitate to use the term game, but in some respects, it is the game that is congressional hearings, and I think it's unfortunate. Like I said, I wish that all of these were truly focused on good public policy and on having that conversation, and having that helpful back and forth, or even asking pointed but relevant questions.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's just not how so many of these go.
And so part of the reason we do these types of conversations and other conversations with people like you is because people seem to think if they disagree on an issue, the other person must be a horrible person. Right? Like, we can't all come from, we come from a certain perspective, and not everybody agrees. I mean, on gun issues specifically, lots of people, lots of different views. And it shocks me when I watch and people really attack you personally. That really bothers me, because I think, as you're saying, if they just want to ask you questions, ask you questions. There's no need to go after you as a human being, and especially when somebody is up there and you're volunteering your time to give testimony, and they're in the position where they can't be interrupted. I have to say, I find that disturbing.
Yeah, again, sometimes at least on my end, you sort of you grow a little numb to it, which I think in and of itself is bad. That we've sort of reached that stage where you sort of expect that vitriol. But I will say this: I have yet to meet a single person in this country or elsewhere, but I've yet to meet a single American who has looked at what happened in Parkland, or who has looked at rising crime numbers, or who opens up the newspaper and reads what horrific story has happened today and sits there and goes, yeah, we're fine with that. That's cool. Yeah, we're pro that guy.
Right. Right.
It just isn't true. There is nobody, literally nobody, who looks at whether it's Uvalde, whether it's domestic violence, and like, yeah, we're good with that. What we're disagreeing about is not how horrific something is. We are disagreeing about how best to address it.
Right.
And at the end of the day, that should be the conversation we're having, because that's what's important. It shouldn't matter, whether you disagree with someone on policy. You should be open to having that conversation, because that conversation is about how do we save lives. And so to just shut down and to go after the person, it's unfortunate. Again, it's unfortunate that it happens. I think a little bit too much on both sides. This is just sort of a problem within the conversation generally. And it doesn't have to be, because this is one of the few issues where, again, I think nobody looks at this and says, yeah, no, that's good. We agree that
Right.
we are fundamentally on the same team about wanting to stop violence. What we disagree about is how best to do it.
Right. And so speaking of that, I was listening to one of your, maybe it was when you were on with Stephen Gutowski on his podcast, I don't remember, which you pointed out he often gets confused for the New England Patriots kicker. I think that's got to be
He does, yes.
absolutely accurate. And I think maybe it was there, or maybe it was on another one of your interviews where you talked about, you thought that the Biden administration, correct me if I'm wrong, was doing a good job on some proposals regarding mental health in veterans. Does that sound right?
Yeah. And I mean, just generally across the board, looking at mental health is a much better starting point than a lot of other potential starting points. So even that in and of itself, to recognize the importance of the underlying issue of mental health, yes, in the gun space, obviously, but also outside of the gun space, is just a fundamental cornerstone problem that sort of transcends guns or no guns. Again, that's always going to be a better starting point than looking at it as just a gun issue.
So is the idea that we have 400, let's say we have 400 million guns in the country, right? Most people are totally responsible, wonderful. We don't have a unique mental health crisis in America, I don't think, versus any other country. Could be wrong, but we do have mental health issues like everybody else has, and guns. So is what you're saying, if we're going to have all of this, we have to do a better job on mental health because the guns are basically a given in this country. Am I saying that right?
To an extent.
Okay.
So here's what I mean about mental health being a deeper, more underlying problem. We have a very high gun suicide rate.
So about 2/3 of
overall-
deaths, just so
Right.
the audience knows, on an annual
Yes,
basis,
yeah.
25,
Correct.
26,000
And
people.
it's a huge part of our gun violence problem. About 60% of gun deaths every year are suicides. But only about half of suicides are carried out with guns, which means that when you look at the total problem that is suicide and suicidality in the United States, half of the people who are committing suicide are doing it without guns. Half of them, of course, are doing it with guns. It's a problem that sort of transcends that, but that certainly involves firearms. And it deals with a specific individual who is suicidal regardless of what means they have with which to harm themselves. So in sort of the view of what is the problem here, it's not the gun per se. So if you take a mentally stable, healthy individual and put a firearm in their hands, that firearm is not going to whisper mean things to them that is going to make them suicidal. What happens is when you have someone who is not in a healthy place and you give them any violent means, whether it's a firearm or pills for overdose or what have you, it makes it infinitely more likely. I mean, not infinite, it's but significantly more likely that person will then harm themselves or others.
The-
So if you want, you can deal with this several ways, right? You can deal with the violent means, which I think is appropriate for someone who's not in a good space, or you can more generally say, look, we have a whole lot of Americans who are not in a good mental space,
Yeah.
and we need to deal with this as that sort of fundamental underlying issue.
One statistic, though, I would point out is that if you're going to try to commit suicide with a gun, you're pretty much going to succeed. And if you try without a gun, you're most likely not. Taking your numbers as half and half suicides with a gun, but if you try without a gun, most of the time it doesn't work. If you try with a gun, and then that goes into, by the way, Amy, you talk a lot about assault weapons, and you very correctly point out that in most deaths with a gun are not from what we call an assault weapon. If you take those 60 or 66% of deaths a year, no one's killing themselves with an assault weapon. And most mass shootings are not from assault weapons.
Right.
And so,
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. Go.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two sort of tangential points with that, right? So the first is, you are absolutely right about how much more dangerous it is for a suicidal person to have access to a firearm than to have access to another lethal means. It's not some one-to-one ratio, which is why I would say it has to be a focus in that case, not just on removing that firearm from that specifically dangerous person, but on getting them help.
Right.
Which I think is, again, a lot of times that gets lost in the conversation. It's not just about disarmament or disarmament of the gun. It's about violent means control, but also addressing that underlying problem, or else you then still have a suicidal person,
So
which is still not good.
On the red flag laws, for example, if you part of what happens then is somebody could petition for the court to take a gun away from somebody temporarily. Part of that, though, has to be, and remind us about the just legislation that just passed.
Sure.
If you're going to take away the person's gun, you should also be providing them with mental health skills so that you're not just taking away their gun and just leaving them out there. Does that sound right?
Right. Yeah. So, look, there are several issues across the board with red flag laws, at least from what I consider a due process standpoint. I'm more than happy to talk about those. But, one of the things when we are talking about a model for red flag laws, which are, again, this idea of sort of targeted specific intervention for people who are in a crisis, whether it's, their violence against themselves or against others, but where they're very clearly in a crisis and don't sort of fit into the existing structure of, like our mental health commitment process. How do we temporarily disarm them? But again, that second point is equally as important. How do we then reroute them toward help? And I think it's very unfortunate that when you look at the 20 or so existing state laws, very, very few of them actually call for a mandated process to get that person help, either by integrating it into existing mental health commitment, mental health court structures that the state has, or ensuring that there is some form of, at least, hey, here are all of the resources we have. Here are referrals we can make, so that that person isn't sort of left out in the cold, disarmed, and still, again, dangerous and in a very unhealthy place. So it's vital, and it's very unfortunate that it's not across the board in all of these states that we're seeing that very important tie-in.
Some do. Is that right?
Some do. Yes. Yes.
Another thing that you work on, by the way, is defensive gun use. You've become you've taken this on, getting all of the research and data on defensive gun use. You have tons of information. And after, listening to you talk a lot and speaking of defensive gun use, one thing I realized is I do not want to mess with your mom, who seems to know how to fire a weapon pretty well.
Well, please don't mess with my mom.
I'm not
generally.
going to mess with your mom from what I heard you talk about when she shot that one time in training. Tell us a little bit about the defensive gun use. What are you seeing that surprises you as you look at the statistics for defensive gun use around the country?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things that surprises most people when they look at the numbers for the first time is just how often this occurs when you look at the survey data on this. We don't have exact numbers. It would be almost impossible to do so. But almost every survey that has looked at this has found that Americans use their guns defensively somewhere between 500,000 to 3 million times a year. I think most often that number, and I think realistically, is probably more around 1 million. Though just within the last month or two, there was the most comprehensive survey ever conducted on gun owners in the United States that put it at about 1.6 million times a year. Most of those do not involve the gun being fired in any capacity. That it's the mere threat or sort of showing of that gun that is sufficient to
talked
keep
to
the
about
crime
that
from
incident
happening.
in Indiana, where the person in a defensive gun use situation, I think they were in a public place.
Sure.
What was that? What was that incident? If you could just tell the audience. So
in the Indiana Mall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a concealed carry permit holder earlier this year in Greenwood, Indiana, who happened to be at a mall where there was an individual who was bent on mass violence. He showed up very clearly with the intent to kill a lot of people. And within, I think the number within 20 or so seconds, that concealed carry permit holder just happened to be within the space and was able to neutralize that shooter. Actually, an incredible shot. When you look at the distance he was, and was able to prevent a significant number of lives from being lost that day. And it's things like that I think even those more high profile stopping of mass shootings happen more often than people realize. Mass shootings are statistically, on the whole, compared to other forms of gun violence, pretty rare. So it's not like this is happening every day, but they do happen several times a year. And I think that number is growing. I think it will continue to grow as you see more states open themselves up to concealed carry permits. You're seeing the number of concealed carry permit holders grow. I think you'll continue to see it grow. This defensive gun use phenomenon is not, even though I think the governor of New York just the other month said something, the good guy with the gun theory is over. It's anything but over. It is a growing phenomenon that has always been a significant part of, I don't know if you want to call it gun culture or sort of the reality of gun ownership in the United States. It happens very often. And it's, I think what you're seeing in terms of concealed carry permitting, you're going to see a more diverse number of concealed carry permit holders acting defensively. Not your usual suspects. You're seeing a growing number of specifically Black and female concealed carry permit holders. So I think this is actually a good thing. And I think you're seeing too that this balance of, on the one hand, this mass of very peaceable, law-abiding citizens who are using their guns to protect themselves and others.
And now Dr. Michael Siegel for Siegel Scope.
Policy. How do you protect them while also recognizing that you have a good number of Americans who are not in a good place, who are using their guns to harm themselves, while also recognizing that when you look at criminal gun violence, you have a lot of illegally owned guns that are being used by criminals to facilitate gun violence and
illegally and stolen guns, that kind of thing.
And that becomes a question: is how do you take this pie and sort of divide it up and figure out how to make good policy out of it?
Well, you're also pointing to the fact that in the last couple of years, the new gun ownership rate amongst Black and Latinos has really skyrocketed in the last couple of years, maybe since COVID started, but just really in the last couple of years. And then logically following that, as there are more gun owners, there'll be more concealed carry permits and more of that. And you're also saying that from your statistics, the threat of having a gun is sometimes enough to prevent a shooting. That's a case of, you're talking about with your defensive gun use statistics. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So most defensive gun uses, again, that weapon's not being fired. It was merely the threat that someone had a weapon and could fire it. That the gun is brandished in some way without being fired. That the criminal says, no, that is not worth it today.
Right. And then
and takes off.
when you put together all this information from probably public records and police departments from everywhere in the country, this is a pretty big undertaking. When you have it all together, what do you do with it? Who do you send it to? How do you make sure that people get your information so they know those statistics?
Sure. So again, a lot of those defensive gun uses they're not going to find their way into a news story somewhere that comes from survey data. But there are a lot of defensive gun uses that do wind up in media reports every year. So what we've done at Heritage is we have our defensive gun use database where we try to pull those reports. And so right now, it's an interactive database that you can view on our website. We try to update it regularly. So you can see sort of what's going on near you. But these are media verified reports. So not reports that someone just said, that this happened to me at some point, but reports that were significant enough that it made it into a news story somewhere that can be verified. Now, again, it's just sort of the tip of the iceberg of the defensive gun uses that we know are out there and occurring because of survey data. But it does show that even just from the small tip of the iceberg, this is a significant phenomenon. And I think it shows, one, sort of the diversity of where these are happening, but two, sort of the range of scenarios that happen for defensive gun uses. I think some people get this idea of, a lot of defensive gun uses, it's would-be vigilantes who are just sort of out there, either, skirting the lines of maybe doing some sketchy activity, and that's why they had to defend themselves. But no, what you see is a lot of these Americans are just living their lives. They're just going about their day, and violence happened to them. Not the other way around, and they were fortunately able to defend themselves and others successfully. This database is all successful defensive gun uses.
Well, that's interesting because it brings us to that point about myths about gun owners in the gun industry. If you never encounter somebody that you know is a gun owner, you may have a totally a view that's really out of step with reality about gun ownership and the gun industry. You probably find that a lot in your travels, right? What are some of those things that you encounter where you say that's just not at all the case?
Well, so first I'm going to deal with gun ownership generally, and then I'll move into the gun industry. From a gun ownership standpoint, I mean, you are absolutely correct. I think one of the driving and growing divides in the national conversation is the fact that you do have a lot of Americans who have never, they certainly didn't grow up with guns. They have probably never handled them. They know very little about them from a technical standpoint or about what laws already exist. And it's a problem when you're trying to have conversations about policy. When so many people don't understand, for example, the difference between a semi-automatic and an automatic gun, or don't understand what current law is, or how most rational gun owners act in a situation. So I think that's a problem for the conversation. Mm-hmm. But in terms of, who are gun owners, I think there's this sort of caricature of your usual suspect, middle-aged white man, probably lives in the rural South. Like, that's your typical gun owner. And most other people, don't own guns. There is this whole broad spectrum of Americans that are gun owners. And like you said, it's growing in diversity, but that diversity to an extent has always been there.
But you know what's interesting, Amy, if I may, just for 1 second? Sure. Congresswoman Karen Bass, running for mayor of Los Angeles, progressive, had guns stolen from her house a couple of weeks ago. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you heard this story. People got arrested for stealing the guns out of her safe. Not sure how they did it, but okay. People were shocked that she owned guns. I was shocked that people were shocked. But because she's a progressive black woman in Los Angeles, the big shock was not that people stole them. It was that she had them in the first place.
Right. Yeah, and this is actually something that irks me a little bit. I mean, just from a personal standpoint, as someone who often gets confused, like, oh, wait, what do you mean young woman in business attire own firearms or have a concealed carry permit? Like, because it's my right too. This actually makes me very happy I'm not happy that her guns were stolen, to be very clear. But when you hear these stories about, not your usual suspects, minority gun owners, female gun owners, embracing the right of the people, especially from a historical context, where you look at the ways in which blacks in this country specifically went through so many bouts of in the post-Civil War South, the laws that were passed specifically to disarm them and to keep them from this fundamental right. It makes me happy. I'm thrilled to see that so many, more diverse segments of the people, the people referred to in the Second Amendment are embracing their rights. And so that's a good thing. Though I think it's unfortunate, and I would actually love to get into this conversation too about stolen firearms. And I think one of the problems you're going to see as more and more gun owners, more and more Americans are becoming gun owners for the first time, is this problem of guns not being secured, people having not necessarily thought through what responsible gun ownership looks like. And to be very clear, I don't know a whole lot about the story you're referring to. I'm in no way suggesting that the Congresswoman was to blame. I don't know enough about that story. But it is an important aspect of, when we talk about gun policy.
Gun storage, I'm going to guess that you would not favor a law on gun storage, but you do believe that people need to be educated on gun storage. Does that sound right?
Right. I mean, as a general rule, the conservative in my position on this is these mandatory safe storage requirements. I understand that they're well intended. They, in practice, have the problem of getting in the way of people who may need to be able to access those firearms in a life or death situation. And it sort of takes it out of the hands of responsible gun owners to make reasonable, informed decisions. Now, that said, it is incumbent upon gun owners to understand where their firearms are at all times, to think through who might be able to access them. This is vital if you have children, either your own children or children who might be in the house. Kids find everything. Like, I found Christmas presents that I was never supposed to. Sorry, mom and dad. Kids find everything. They will get curious. They will look for the guns. Be cognizant of that. Be cognizant of what happens if someone breaks into my home when I'm not there. How are my guns secured? A lot of gun owners don't realize until it's too late when their guns have been stolen. The sort of mental and emotional burden and guilt that comes with, oh my goodness, my guns were stolen and then used in a crime to hurt someone. That is something that I wish upon no gun owner. But it's, safe storage, even in times of, what do you do if someone in your household is now going through a mental health crisis? How do you secure your firearms from them? What happens if you are going through a mental health crisis as a gun owner? How are you potentially going to secure your firearms from yourself? Which again is part of a broader conversation of how gun owners need to approach mental health.
I heard in one of your interviews, Amy, where you said that you yourself wanted your guns not in your possession at a couple of points. Does that sound right?
So this is something that is very difficult for a lot of gun owners to talk about, and I understand it, because one, there's sort of the stigma that comes with talking about your own mental health, and two, there is the fear that it will be used against you, right? That you did the responsible thing, but somewhere down the road, someone will be like, oh, well, at one point, she asked someone to remove, her firearms, or to just take care of them for a little bit because she's not in a good space. And I think that's unfortunate, because it is something. This is very personal to me, and I think it is the mark of responsible gun ownership, that I did the right thing at the time, to say, look, I'm not in a good headspace. I'm not, actively suicidal necessarily, but I'm not in a good space, and I don't want to find out what happens if this gets worse. To sort of nip that in the bud. It is something we have to talk about, that we have to normalize. When we're looking at 60% of gun deaths that are suicides. You can't ignore that. It's part of a broader conversation. And the way I like to phrase to sort of word this to gun owners is, we as gun owners go through every possible scenario, we know what our reaction is. Some of us have marked off sort of distances in our homes. What if someone breaks in? At what point do I shoot? Do I not shoot? Do I draw my gun here? Do I not draw my gun there? We have every contingency planned, except for if the threat is inside the house, so to speak. What do you do when the threat is yourself? What do you do when the threat is someone you love who's near you? Do you have that mental health contingency plan? And I have to say, this is actually one of the proudest moments of my life is being able to look back now and to say, no, I had that plan. That when it happened, I knew what I was going to do, and I did it. And it's so important. It's so important.
You were able to think
back,
rationally, even no matter what you were going through yourself, because you had thought it through in advance of what you might do in this case.
You think it through in advance, and you have the plan so that you don't have to think about it. You just know, this is what I do. And again, it's hard to, because it's the what ifs, right? It's easy to look back and be like, okay, I could have been fine either way, but it's the what ifs. What if I'm not? And you don't want to go down that road. And so I really encourage gun owners, I don't know what that looks like for you personally, but to think through that contingency plan and to have it in place so that you don't have to find out. You don't have to find out how much willpower you do or don't have. Because at the end of the day, the reason you own firearms, or the reason so many of us own firearms, is to protect life, to protect innocent life. And if that firearm itself is now the most coherent and immediate threat to you because you're not in a good place, it no longer serves its purpose. It's now no longer the thing protecting you. Just like we talked about, when you have someone who's not in a good place and you add lethal means to that, it's far, far more likely to have a bad outcome. And so again, it's about recognizing that. It's about recognizing the statistics, the probability of what the threat actually is. And sometimes, that threat is I'm not in a good place. And statistically, I'm far more likely to harm myself at this point than to need it against an intruder, and recognizing that.
Now, there
it's
are
important.
things that are, percolating. One is when we talk about storage, there are laws in some places. You're familiar, I'm sure, with Ethan's law in Connecticut. The story there was that the kid went to a friend's house. They found a gun. They thought the gun wasn't loaded. He shot. He died. And that prompted this Ethan's law, which has come up for conversation in Congress, has not passed, but has come up in conversation that would make it a law federally for gun storage. That's one thing. And then two, and you and I have talked about this individually, is technology around gun storage. And, the overarching foundation that I work with that funds 97% has invested in a company called Vera in Albany, New York, which makes a safe that looks like a holster, but it's thumbprint technology. And it's kind of amazing. But the impetus for it, Amy, is what you are talking about, which is stolen guns are very often used in crimes. If you ask anybody in law enforcement, they'll tell you that this happens way too often, and in suicides as well. Where do you stand on that technology and guns?
Well, look, I think technology is good. This is technology that is trying to address a very valid concern, right? Which is, when you're a gun owner, you're trying to weigh these costs and benefits, right? So on the one hand, you want a gun that is readily accessible. You don't want a gun that you have to go through, 8 hoops and memorize a 12-digit code and wait 5 minutes. And you want something that's readily accessible if God forbid you're in an immediate life or death situation. But you also, like we talked about, you don't want that gun getting stolen. One, because it's expensive property, and two, there's sort of that guilt that comes with, shoot, my gun was stolen by a criminal who can now use it to harm other people. That is a terrible feeling. And so you're trying to balance those two things. And so this technology is trying to bridge that divide, right? To allow for easy access of a gun, but that is also otherwise secured, so that even if it's stolen, it's essentially inoperable. Now, when we get into things like mandated technology for like smart guns, not necessarily smart holsters, but smart guns. It's not there yet. And the question sort of becomes, how reliable is it? How expensive is it? And does the government have a business mandating it if they're not willing to mandate it, for example, for its officers and patrol cars? Should we make the public have this very expensive technology that isn't reliable enough that the government is mandating?
That's
it for
down
itself?
the road, though. We're not there
Right.
in terms of, there was
Right.
the issue with New Jersey. Is that what you're referring to?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But so I just mean generally down the
Yeah.
road, because this is the direction that
Right.
technology is moving in. Just sort of things to think about. But on the whole, this idea, technology, we're seeing good advances from it that I think are trying to meaningfully address these problems and sort of make that cost benefit analysis easier for gun owners. And that's a good thing on the whole.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's when we started looking into it, it wasn't as far along as you would think that it would be. And now, for example, there's a company called BioFire, which I think is, if they haven't, it's pretty close to bringing a smart gun to the market, which I think could be a game changer in some ways. It's really, really advanced. They've really moved pretty quickly. I have a couple more questions for you, Amy. I could talk to you all day because you know so much. Two things. One is, I was curious if when you talk to people who don't agree with you, and I'm really thinking of Capitol Hill, are there people that you could say specifically are more listening to you, even if they don't agree with you? Are there a couple of members of Congress who you find, even if they don't agree, for example, when I used to go to Capitol Hill and meet with Orrin Hatch's office, I loved meeting with Orrin Hatch's office because there was no office more open to hearing ideas, except for maybe Chuck Schumer's, than Orrin Hatch's office and Orrin Hatch, right? He didn't always agree, we didn't always agree, but they always listened. Do you find that there are people that you don't necessarily agree with, but they are open to a conversation?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I unfortunately have not had the experience of, I have yet to have a Democratic member of Congress ask me to come in and just talk with them one-on-one about firearm policy. Though I would love that. There is literally no one that I would turn down that opportunity to talk with one-on-one. I will say some of my experiences within the Senate, even in terms of like the questions that have been posed, I've had better experiences. Though again, I think I'd probably disagree with him on a number of like high profile policies. Senator Cory Booker has I think asked some pretty good questions. And I had a pretty good experience with Senator Feinstein, at least allowing open-ended questions, allowing us to speak and respond openly with some of the questions, which I think is fortunate. And again, just, that's the point of these hearings is you've brought us in, ask us the questions, let us talk about it. It's one of those things where, like I said, because I haven't had that experience of like, hey, come and talk with us one-on-one, which I would love. At least through the lines of asking better questions, those are the experiences that
How do you see us being able to have better conversations? Because as we said at the beginning of this conversation, Amy, people they get so mad, they get boxed into their position, and then they think the other person is horrible if they disagree with them. And it's not just true on gun issues. It's true on many issues now. How do you see those specifically on gun issues, people who disagree? How do you recommend that we have better conversations?
Yeah. Well, so I think part of it is just from a general standpoint of like getting to know that person, right? Like if you're having conversations with your friends, it's as a general rule better than starting off with yelling policy things at a stranger. But that said, one of the things when I talk with Second Amendment advocates in general is, you've heard the phrase, facts don't care about your feelings, which is true to an extent, but we're talking with people and people have feelings and people care very deeply about their feelings. We're dealing, especially in the gun policy world, we're dealing with a lot of times on the other side, people who have a very true, I would say a lot of times not necessarily based in reality, but a very real and deeply felt fear of, whether it's mass shootings, whether it's the personal, trauma, things that they've experienced in their families. They're dealing with a lot of, whether it's grief, fear, very deeply felt feelings. You have to start from acknowledging that. That for people dealing in this space, that this is not some abstract thing that we're talking about. For a lot of people, this is very real and deeply felt. And to start with acknowledging that, to start from that space of, like, I understand that whether it's, you've gone through this traumatic experience, whether it's that you fear your kids going to school, like my mom's a teacher, I come from a family of teachers. I get that. That's a very real fear. I've lived in neighborhoods where there are shootings right outside the block, where you sort of fear going out to your car in the day. It's very real. And you start from not dismissing that fear, but of helping them to understand, like, we're on the same page that this is bad. What we're talking about is how to actively and best address it. So let's talk about that. Because now we're not talking about, oh, well, you're just overreacting or I'm dismissing your fears. Now we're talking about, okay, how do we address that? I agree that this is a problem. So I guess to sum that all up, you start with not just dismissing their fears. You start with acknowledging their fears and helping them to understand we are talking about how to address that. And to help them, from my standpoint, understand how sometimes the gun control laws they want are actually not going to best address that. That there are other better, more efficient ways of dealing with these very real problems, but to acknowledge that these are very real problems.
Amy, your knowledge is unbelievable. I know we can go on and on. I would ask you, while we have you, to think about, to tag somebody, see how we use that tag thing, to tag a guest who you think we should talk to. They can't be as knowledgeable as you, because that's impossible. But who else do you think that we should talk to?
See, you had me with, I would have nominated Stephen Gutowski, but it seems as though he has already nominated me. So I'm a bit at a loss. I will tag someone. And now I feel bad because the answer I had off the top of my head has been taken.
Well, we had Stephen Gutowski himself, and he was terrific. And for folks that don't know, The Reload, right? That's Stephen Gutowski's.
I do have one for you. Have you had Kyle Ann Hunter?
We have not. No. Who is that?
Okay. So she she was a former combat helicopter pilot, who joined. She was running. I think she's still affiliated with Brady, but it was their End Family Fire campaign. She was working on that. Now I think she's at Rand.
Okay, perfect.
Doing some of their gun policy.
That'd be great. Okay, we'll definitely do that. Thank you, Amy. I can't thank you enough. Your knowledge is, like I said, is amazing. I think, you really, watching you keep your cool is really exemplary. You talked before about how to have good conversations, and I know when I've seen you speaking publicly that you do exactly the thing that you recommended that people do. So I just want to say thank you very much and really appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. These are my favorite sorts of conversations, because they're meaningful. They are the conversations that are supposed to be happening that I hope more and more people continue to have.
Today, joining us for a very special edition of Siegel's Scope is Dr. Michael Siegel of Tufts University. We have brought in Dr. Siegel to talk about the research that Tufts is doing for 97% research, which has been just released. Dr. Siegel is joining us today. Dr. Siegel, tell us about the research, the goals of this research, and what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and then we'll get into all the amazing stuff you did accomplish.
So there were really two parts to the research. The first part was a survey of 1,000 gun owners, a nationally representative sample of 1,000 gun owners. And what made this survey unique is that we really wanted to find out what are the basic principles that underlie gun owners' opinions about gun policies. So we certainly asked about gun policies, but we really wanted to know what was behind those opinions. What were the principles that guided those opinions? And the second thing that was unique about the survey is that we not only asked general questions about gun owners' opinions, but we asked about the specific details of each of the different policies. So we would ask about a particular policy, and then we would not just leave it at, yes or no, do they support it, but we would look at each of the specific provisions that often appear in those policies and get gun owners' opinions about those specific provisions. And so that's what really made this unique.
Okay, so when we talk about it's unique, you're saying that basically when somebody does a survey or a focus group, it's a broad question. The broad question might be, do you favor assault weapons ban? Do you favor background checks? We call ourselves 97%, for example, because in a survey, that's the number that favor background checks. However, what you're also saying is that when you get into that in more detail, you may gain or lose a few people here and there. And the reason for that is because of the detailed provisions which other people have not surveyed.
That's exactly right. And, as we go along, we'll present some of that data so that people get a sense of how important it is.
And in this survey, part of the uniqueness is very infrequently, not never, but infrequently do we see gun owners surveyed.
Yeah, and I think that we don't often, there have been some gun owner surveys, but we don't usually ask gun owners about their opinions about specific policies. I mean, we ask just a general question, but we don't usually ask them, how do you feel about these specific details? What specific provisions would you support or would you not support?
Another thing that you did, Dr. Siegel, was, what we have found when we talk to people is that gun owners often feel as if the questions are immediately biased, that they're not, that they would not phrase the questions the way that some of these surveys do. But you spoke to a lot of people in advance of the survey, is that correct? To figure out how to phrase the questions.
Exactly. We spoke to a lot of gun owners and a lot of gun rights organizations. And in fact, we actually pre-tested the survey with them. We actually sent them copies of the survey instrument, the questions, and asked them to give us comments back. So we really made an attempt to make this survey something that gun owners would the questions they would resonate with. And understand the questions without necessarily being turned off by the questions themselves.
So the survey itself was gun owners, but you had the buy-in of both gun rights organizations and gun reform organizations when you created the survey.
Well, we had their input.
Yeah.
We had their input and interest, I think, because this was so unique and because we were taking the time to talk to gun owners. I mean, gun owners are the most knowledgeable actually about the process. They know exactly what goes on when you do a background check. They know the process of buying a gun, selling a gun, borrowing a gun, transferring a gun, and getting a permit. They know exactly what's entailed in all of those things. And so our hypothesis was that if we talk to gun owners, they may have some unique insights that we as public health practitioners might not have. And that's that's certainly what we were hoping for.
And from this survey and focus groups, you then came out with, tell me the most important conclusions of the survey.
Sure. So I think the most important conclusion we found was that gun owner support for virtually all gun policies is extremely dependent on the specific provisions that are in the legislation. So, for example, to take red flag laws as an example, we found that if a red flag law did not contain a provision that had a penalty for people who vindictively use that law to try to get someone's guns taken away illegitimately, gun owners almost uniformly opposed the law. But the same law, if it did have a penalty, and if it did have provisions for due process, overwhelming percentage of gun owners did support the law.
So let me interrupt you there, Dr. Siegel. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So the vast majority of Americans supports red flag laws. When you get into gun owners, while gun owners specifically may support red flag laws, they will do so if you make sure that there's a penalty for being vindictive, and that will not affect the support of non-gun owners. In other words, non-gun owners already support it. They're not going to reduce their support based on that, but you will increase the support of gun owners for red flag laws if you do that.
Exactly. And the numbers are pretty striking. For example, if you just ask gun owners, simple question, do you support red flag laws? We found that about 72.9%, 73% of gun owners said, yes, I support that. So that's a pretty high level of support. But then if you ask them, does it depend on the provisions in the law? Only 22% of gun owners said that they would unequivocally support a red flag law, despite what the provisions in that law might be. And then on the other extreme, if all of the provisions that we mentioned were included in the law, and those are things like making sure there's a penalty for vindictive use of the law, making sure that there's due process, making sure that there's timely return of the guns after the order is rescinded or runs out.
Mental health as well.
Mental health examinations of the subject of the order, of the protective order. With all those provisions in the law, support actually goes up to 81%,
Wow.
An overwhelming level of support.
Wow. And that's amongst gun owners, the 81%?
Yes.
And so you can imagine that non-gun owners, that number's even higher, and most people are not gun owners. So that's pretty amazing. So, and that's one conclusion. Can you give us a couple of other conclusions from your research?
Yeah. I think the second most important finding was that there is a huge area of common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners. When we ask gun owners about the principles that underlie their support or opposition to gun laws, the most important principle is that we need to try to identify people who are at the highest risk of violence and prevent them from accessing guns, while at the same time not interfering with the rights of law-abiding gun owners to obtain guns. That is the overriding principle. And what we found is that if you adhere to that principle, if your policy is consistent with that principle, then gun owners will generally support it. And if it violates that policy, you'll lose that support.
So what is is that for a felony or a misdemeanor?
So we found that gun owners supported the idea uniformly, or not uniformly, but almost uniformly, of not allowing people who have who've been convicted of any violent crime, not just felonies, but even at the misdemeanor level. Gun owners generally felt that, if someone is adjudicated as having committed a crime that involves violence, that person is not appropriate to have a gun and should not be allowed to have a gun.
The key being the word convicted.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, there needs to be due process.
Right.
You can't just take an accusation against someone and then use that and say, okay, well, we're going to take your gun. But people need to understand that under current federal law, if you are adjudicated, convicted of a misdemeanor crime of violence, you are not prohibited from owning a gun. You are only prohibited if you are convicted and given a sentence as a felony. So if you're not charged with and convicted of a felony, you can commit as many violent crimes as you want, and according to federal law, you can still own a gun. And so, we found that to be probably the biggest loophole in current law that everyone would support. Gun owners, non-gun owners alike, would support that provision. And so, basically what we concluded overall from the study is that there is an area of common ground between gun owners and non-gun owners, and that area of common ground is large enough that one could build a policy platform that's consistent with that common ground. And based on that common ground, that is effective in reducing gun violence and that does not put the public at any increased danger, but at the same time does not interfere with the rights of gun owners, law-abiding gun owners, to obtain guns.
Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Siegel. When you say this would have an effect on violence, what effect would it have? Because very frequently when you talk to folks, they'll say, well, that doesn't matter. It's not going to affect anybody anyway, right? That's the reason not to vote not to vote for a certain piece of legislation. You're saying that these provisions that you've mentioned, so you mentioned red flag laws and you mentioned criminal misdemeanors, right? Convictions. Taken all told, what kind of effect does this have on gun violence if we had these laws in place?
So we found that there were really 4 policies that were the most effective in terms of having a major influence on gun violence. And those were the 2 that we've talked about, red flag laws and these violent misdemeanor laws. And also permitting laws that require someone to have a permit to own a gun, along with background checks, universal background checks. And the permitting and background checks work together because in order to get a permit, you have to undergo a background check.
What's the difference in the background checks that you're talking about versus any current background checks now? What's the difference?
So the difference is that we're talking about state permitting laws. We're talking about state laws that require a state permit to own or purchase a gun in that state. And the advantage of that is really twofold. The advantage for public safety is that you're doing a local and state background check, which is much more efficient and effective than a federal background check. The NICS system, the federal NICS system, which is used for background checks, is known to be missing huge amounts of data on all kinds of criminal offenses, domestic violence offenses. But the states and certainly local governments are much more likely to have complete comprehensive data sets, especially for things like misdemeanors, domestic violence offenses. Local courts have that information. Local law enforcement has that information. So the advantage of this for public safety is that you're doing background checks at the state and local level rather than just the federal level. And you're much more likely to be able to catch people who have a history of violence. The advantage of this for gun owners is that by doing the background checks first, in order to get a permit, you actually don't have to do background checks every time you go and buy a gun. Federal law allows for the NICS check to be waived in certain states if a person has a permit, and if the government feels that permitting system is sufficient to screen out people who should and should not have guns. So there's a big advantage here potentially for gun owners. Now, what we found is that the combination of these 4 laws would be predicted by our statistical models to reduce firearm violence by 28%.
Wow.
And to reduce suicide by about 4%.
So let me just sort of get specific there. There are about 45,000 deaths with guns a year. Obviously, many more people injured, but let's just say deaths. You're saying that number would drop significantly. And these are lives that we're talking about. So if it was one person, that would be significant, right? But these are lives, and these are a lot of lives. If these provisions, which are supported by gun owners, would become law. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the really important findings from our study, is that even if you just adopted a small set of laws that gun owners support, we're not even getting into gun laws that gun owners oppose. But if you just took that common ground and put into place the laws that gun owners support, you could have we estimate about a 28% decline in firearm homicide and another 4% on firearm suicide. 28% drop, that's almost a third. That is a huge public health impact. And you're right, when you're talking about 45,000 lives a year, a third of that is 15,000. 15,000. The effect sorry, the 28% effect would be on the homicides.
Right.
So we have about 21,000 homicides a year, but that's still 7,000 lives that
Yep.
you're saving.
That would be tremendous. That's a tremendous amount. So let's go over for one more second these provisions that you've discussed. So on gun permitting laws, can you explain to us what exists now and what would change with gun permitting laws?
So yeah, so at the federal level, there's nothing. There's no requirement for any kind of gun permit or license. There are a number of states, a small number of states, approximately 12, that have a requirement that you have to have a state permit or state license in order to purchase or possess a gun. And so that's what we're talking about. So it would be basically a state law, just like a driver's license. You can't drive a car without having a license.
But in the state law part of it, would you first pass the background check, then get the permit? Is that how this would work? And then you would not need to do it again if you purchased another gun because you've already done it?
Exactly. And so you would basically, in order to get the permit, you would have to undergo the background check. And the background check would be a very, very comprehensive check because it would be done not just through the federal NIC system, but it would be done through state and local records. And it would be focusing on the greatest risk factor for violence, which is the violent misdemeanors, which right now usually fall through the cracks. So you would get that background check, you'd have the permit. And once you have the permit, anytime you want to go buy a gun, you just show the permit and they know that you've gone through the background checks. You wouldn't necessarily need to go through a background check every single time you buy a gun. And that's why we think this would really streamline the process for gun owners and make it a lot easier for them to not be troubled by these background checks every single time they buy a gun.
What would you say, Dr. Siegel, surprised you you've been doing research on gun issues for a while. You did tobacco for a long time. We're very influential in that area, and you've been very influential. One of the most that I could think of in speaking to both sides on the gun issue. It's a pretty rare thing that you're able to do. So you've been familiar with gun rights organizations and familiar with gun safety organizations. What surprised you in your conclusions?
I think the thing that surprised us the most was that gun owners overwhelmingly want to be a part of the solution. They consistently said that they're concerned about the levels of gun violence in the country and that they want to be part of doing something about it. In addition, the overwhelming majority of gun owners said that they don't see an inherent conflict between the Second Amendment and most gun laws, especially gun laws that are intended to keep guns out of the hands of people who are at high risk for violence. And so the idea here that all gun owners are, they're not interested in the problem of gun violence, they don't want to do anything about it, it's just not true. Just like anyone else, they are, devastated when they see school shootings, mass shootings, urban violence, and they want to do something about it. And they believe that most of the laws can be implemented without interfering with the Second Amendment. But the key thing for gun owners is that the focus needs to be on keeping guns out of the hands of people who are at high risk for violence. That's the basic principle that they want to see encapsulated in the law. Laws that just interfere with law-abiding gun owners and their ability to obtain guns or transfer guns, to borrow guns to a family member, laws that just interfere with that are not favored. But laws that are really targeted at making sure that people who really are at risk here, people with a history of violence, cannot access these guns. Gun owners are all for that, and we believe we'll join together with non-gun owners in supporting those laws, as long as we make sure that they have the provisions that are necessary to gain gun owner support.
So we're going to wrap it up, Dr. Siegel. But first, I just have to say, you worked on tobacco issues, you're working on guns and public safety. So I just want to say thank you, because you've taken on some of the biggest issues that there are and are working to save, as you've mentioned in the case of the provisions on gun issues, That would save a lot of lives. On the tobacco issue, you've saved a lot of lives. So I just want to say thank you for working with us, and we really appreciate all the work you've done.
Well, thanks so much for that, Matt, and thank you for what you're doing, what the 97% is doing, in really novel and unique effort to bring gun owners and non-gun owners together. And based on our research findings from the study, we think this is a winning approach. We see that there is common ground. We believe that the principles that both gun owners and non-gun owners support are enough to build a really effective policy platform that will save many, many lives.
Thank you, Dr. Siegel, and thank you for joining us today on TAG. I'm Matthew Littman, your host of TAG. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, we'd love for you to subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and tell your friends about us. You can find more episodes of TAG on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Give us a follow on Instagram and Twitter at 97%org, and tag who you'd like us to chat with next. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.